Meet Daniel. Daniel is 4, going on 5 years old. Daniel is getting ready to start kindergarten in the fall. He got kicked out of preschool. According to Daniel's teachers, he doesn't know how to play well with others because when he loses games, he throws a temper tantrum and turns the board over. Daniel is also disruptive during group time because he calls his peers poopy heads and makes the ever-entertaining armpit fart noise repeatedly. Daniel's caregiver received 40 calls about his negative behaviors in 1 week. She was called to pick him up on a Friday and told that he was no longer welcome to come back to his preschool. Instead, maybe he would be better served in an environment where there weren't any other children. Now meet Sawyer. Sawyer is an 18-month-old little guy whose family describes him as energetic and fun and amazing. Sawyer was kicked out of daycare. According to Sawyer's daycare providers, he is the angriest 18-month-old they had ever seen because he threw temper tantrums and he pushed his peers. Sawyer also lacked empathy, according to his caregivers, because he refused to share toys. And after pushing one of his peers, refused to come give that peer a hug and apology. Sawyer's parents were called to come pick him up early one day, and were told that he was welcome to continue attending, but in order to do so, they would have to hire a private aide, so essentially a nanny, to accompany Sawyer to daycare, so that he wouldn't get into any trouble. This is on top of the more than $1,000 a month in tuition they were paying. Sawyer and Daniel are just 2 examples of the many kids who get kicked out or expelled from early childhood settings. When I talk about early childhood, I mean any kind of setting or program that serves kids out of the home between the ages of 0 and 6. Sometimes it's daycares, where kids are spending their time while parents are working or going to school. Sometimes it's preschool programs. Sometimes it's pre-kindergarten programs that are affiliated with a public school setting. Sometimes it's Head Starts. So you're all probably sitting there thinking, okay, I get it, Sawyer, Daniel, but really, how often is this happening? It's happening a lot. In a K-12 setting, the rate of expulsion per child is about 1 out of every 500. When we go down to kindergartens, or pre-kindergartens, that are associated with public schools, the rate jumps up to 1 in 125. When we then look at all settings serving children between the ages of 0 and 6, the rate jumps up to 1 in out of every 37. And when we specifically consider the private child care centers where we're sending our kids and paying more than our mortgage, the rate jumps up to 1 in 12. For a little bit of context, the ratio in Ohio for 3 to 4-year-olds is 12 children per 1 preschool teacher. 1 out of every 12 of those children on average is going to be kicked out. Boys are 3 times more likely to be kicked out than girls. And children who are black are 2.5 times more likely than children who are white. Okay, so those are some big numbers. But kids must be doing really terrible stuff to get kicked out of preschool, right? Yeah, not so much. So the stuff that they're doing that gets them kicked out are developmentally typical, maybe a little bit on the extreme end, expressions of big feelings, temper tantrums, little bits of minor aggression toward peers, not wanting to participate in group activities, not wanting to follow the directions of teachers. These things that we expect developmentally typical children between the ages of 0 and 6 to be doing on an average everyday basis. And we care about this because it sets these kids up for negative life outcomes. There's been a good amount of research that supports when kids experience this exclusionary discipline, when they get kicked out, they start to develop negative attitude towards school. They start to not want to go. Instead of having school be a warm, welcoming, fun place where they're eager to attend, teachers are people who don't care about them, who don't want to work with them, and who couldn't care less if this kid is in their classroom. Often, they're praying that that kid doesn't come to their classroom that day. what that does for these kids is sets them up for failure, so that the people who are supposed to be educating them don't care, so then the kids don't care. And they wind up starting to fail grades. And then they wind up dropping out. And then they experience all of the negative life outcomes that follow. The Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, OMAS, saw this issue happening and decided it was something to address. So they partnered with Nationwide Children's, and we have an early childhood mental health program here, to propose this idea of the Ohio Preschool Expulsion Prevention Partnership. And this is where my research got started. So I'm an early childhood mental health consultant. I work with kids 0 to 6, typically who have some behaviors. And I started seeing all of the kids and families that were coming in through this expulsion hotline. And I began to wonder, what in the world is this like for families? Because I know if my childcare experience were disrupted, my ability to participate in everything else that I participate in would be hugely impacted. And so as a part of my PhD studies, I decided to really explore the families and hear their stories about this issue. So here's what they said. The families said that instead of centers managing child behaviors, it was put on them. So just imagine that you send your child to a child care center. These are the experts. They're the ones who are supposed to know how to deal with kids and behaviors. If any of you have kids in centers, I am sure you have asked the teacher on 10,000 occasions, what do I do for potty training? How do I handle it if they're picky eating? All that kind of stuff. They're the experts, right? But when it comes to behaviors, the centers place that back on the families. And they do things like call and text the families 30 or 40 times in a week. Or send the kid home every single day at nap time because they won't just lay down on their cot. When that happens, families quite naturally experience a tremendous amount of stress. So if your phone rings and you see that it's your child's school, you have some thoughts about that. You automatically think, oh my gosh, they fell off the swing and broke their arm. Or you start to feel some stress. And when that happens day in, day out, hour in, hour out, that gets old real quick. And when that happens, when you are working in a low-wage job, when you're working in a job where you're not allowed to have your phone on the floor, where you don't get sick time to be able to take off and pick your kid up early, that greatly affects our caregivers. And so then we get into this area of caregiver conflict, and this comes in a couple of ways. One, in a multiple caregiver household, we get caregivers arguing over who's doing the right thing with the kid, because we know not everybody parents the same. And when you have kids who are having some behaviors, it's especially evident that not everybody parents the same, and there's a lot of conflict that comes up around that. The other thing that this does is it brings in a sense of conflict between the caregiver and the child. The caregiver is no longer sure how to feel about their kid, because these experts have said, there must be something terribly wrong with your kid. They are the most aggressive 18-month-old I have ever seen. And then with all of this, caregivers are seeking supports. So they do this with external supports like family members. They put grandma and auntie on call for when kid needs to be picked up early from childcare. But they also do this by turning to medical professionals for help and advice. Daycare providers or child care providers are supposed to be the experts on child care. Pediatricians and other child health providers are supposed to be the experts on child health. And so when parents turn to their pediatricians for advice on this issue, they're really looking, very desperately seeking some sort of help. What happens, interestingly, is that they receive all kinds of information. Some of it good, some of it bad, some of it just kind of useless. Families describe being told that it's normal, the behaviors are typical, no big deal, whatever, which we would agree with for the most part in the early childhood world. And yet the child's been kicked out of 3 or 4 centers. And so we have a tremendous functional impairment going on, even if the behaviors are typical. Or families are told, whew, man, if the center says there's something wrong with your kid, there must be something wrong with your kid. Let's send him to psychiatry and get that 3-year-old on ADHD medicine. And then the family feels a whole nother way because, oh my gosh, there must be something really wrong with my kid. They also experience a deficit in supports because nobody wants to babysit the behavior kid. So the good news is there are some solutions that this research also put together. The first one is that education, training, and support for early childhood providers for the people who are caring for children in early childhood settings makes a huge difference. So when providers receive training and consultation and coaching and guidance around how to manage challenging behaviors, kids don't get kicked out. Interestingly, in the state of Ohio, there is no requirement that any child care provider ever has to receive developmentally appropriate practice training or training on how to manage behaviors. The Ohio Preschool Expulsion Prevention Program provides that training for free to the centers with whom we're working. The other solution is this idea of quick and appropriate linkage to early childhood specific services. So pediatricians are seeing kids throughout the age spectrum, all day, every day. Early childhood specialists see kids between the ages of 0 and 6 exclusively. So we're really working with these kids, and we really have a clear sense of developmentally typical, developmentally atypical, and a whole bucket of strategies that we can use to help families manage some of these behaviors. I'm going to take you back to Daniel. Daniel's story doesn't end terribly happily, and it's still being written. So Daniel has now been kicked out of a second daycare center. His first daycare center declined any additional education or support. They said they weren't interested. It wasn't a center issue. It was a child issue. Daniel's pediatrician adopted a wait-and-see approach, told his caregiver, you know, he sounds like a pretty typical 4-year-old boy to me. I'm not super concerned. Daniel's caregiver decided that wasn't enough, so she self-referred to an early childhood program, and she's now on the wait list. Daniel is due to start kindergarten in August. He probably won't receive services until September. 4 months is a long time in the life of a 4-year-old. His caregiver reports that she is really terrified for when he starts kindergarten because she can see 2 things already happening with Daniel. 1, he's not in a center-based program, so he's not gaining experience on how to manage peer interactions. He doesn't know how to get along with his friends, and he's not having opportunities to learn that skill. 2, Daniel, at the ripe old age of 4 3/4, has already developed these negative school attitudes. He does not want to go to kindergarten. He is not at all excited about this upcoming transition. And he makes statements such as, the teachers don't like me. Nobody's going to play with me. And all of these things that start to portend these negative life outcomes. Sawyer, on the other hand, is doing amazing. Sawyer's caregivers decided not to hire a nanny to accompany him to childcare and put him in a new setting. His current providers are incredibly excited about the idea of providing developmentally appropriate, positive behavior supports for an energetic, amazing, incredible 18-month-old. They describe him as one of the sweetest little boys they've ever worked with. In addition to being in a developmentally appropriate setting where they're using appropriate behavior supports, Sawyer's parents also took him to the pediatrician the day after he got kicked out. Pediatrician got him linked within a week with an early childhood mental health specialist who ruled out any of the major big concerns in childhood and kind of narrowed it down to Sawyer is a typical 18-month-old kid. Maybe a little bit more high-spirited than average, but he's typical. Sawyer's mom stated that she cannot wait until he graduates at the top of his class from high school, and she can tell his teachers, can you believe he got kicked out of daycare? So it's my hope that with this research, that with being able to share the stories of the families that this affects, that we can bring exposure to the issue, which is much, much greater than we ever realized it was. And that we can also start to really honor and provide the supports that some of the youngest children in our community need to have the best possible outcomes, regardless of their behaviors at the age of 3 and 4. Thank you.